now she comes to us at a truly epiphanal moment, the day before perhaps the most critical hearing in at least the recent history of the court, which could change its composition for a generation. Who better to take us through these thickets of jurisprudence, now straight from Yale Law, what might be called the eye of the hurricane, Linda Greenhouse.
So when I was a baby reporter on Metro, I came upon and wrote actually a very wonderful story about a cadet at West Point who had been subjected for his last 2 or 3 years at the military academy to a practice called the silence, where nobody talked to him. And anyway, it was a big deal at this time. And so I was put up for a Silurian award to be given to a young journalist under the age of, I guess, 30. And I didn't win it. I got honorable mention, and the woman who won for having been hit over the head with a pocketbook by Martha Mitchell, who was, who was, for the younger people in the room, the wife of Richard Nixon's Attorney General, who was going around the country saying she knew the real story about Watergate, and either she did or she was crazy, or I don't know, but they ended up, John Mitchell ended up locking her up in some place. Anyway, but this young woman, journalist, had the nerve to approach her in some public place, and Martha Mitchell hit her over the head, and that won her the Silurian Award. So anyway, so thank you for inviting me. And every time I sat down to sort of write a more formal kind of talk, you know, another crazy thing would happen. And actually another crazy thing just happened while we were having lunch. Michael Avenatti has just come out with his client and the ostensible details of some more sordid allegations against our Supreme Court nominee. I have no idea what to make of it, but things having been happening in real time and with amazing intensity. I have not written a speech, so I'll just say a few things, but I gather from questions at the table that people will have questions, and I'm happy to talk about anything, current events, journalism. So I do have this little book out, which is in the nature of a memoir. It's not a kind of I was born type of memoir. It's really a very personal take on the practice of journalism. And so I'll just mention a couple of my observations about journalism. And of course, it's mainly seen through the eyes of the New York Times, where I did work for 40 years, took a buyout in 2008, stood up in the newsroom in the Washington Bureau and proclaimed in a loud voice, "I'm never going to take another man's paycheck." And within 3 days, I had been hired to teach full-time at Yale Law School, which I've been doing for the last 10 years. In addition to writing under contract for the New York Times op-ed, mostly web op-ed page every 2 weeks. So I like to say I traded in my full-time job at the New York Times for 2 full-time day jobs. But anyway, I do make a series of observations, and one of them was brought home to me earlier this month, a page 1 story by a couple of very distinguished Washington correspondents for the Times, and under the headline of "With a Barb, Trump blurs a legal line." And what was the legal line that he blurred? He denounced the Justice Department for having had the nerve to indict 2 Republican congressmen for various criminal fraudulent activities, and the story recounts that. And then, all of a sudden, we have this paragraph. But David B. Rifkin, a Washington lawyer and veteran of past Republican administrations, said it was fair to question why the Justice Department charged the 2 congressmen so close to an election, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, thank God my book is not out of date, because I have a long riff in this short book about this fellow, David Rifkin, who, if you Google his name and the New York Times, or if you can navigate the new and mysteriously incredibly degraded Times Online archive, I don't know what has happened to it. Does anyone here agree with me? It used to be so reliable, and within the last year, it's just gone completely. And so every time I do a search, which is almost always fruitless, you get down to the bottom and it says, please rate your experience. And I always say terrible, and it always says, give us the reason for your response. And I say this has become completely degraded, and I can never find anything. And why don't you put it back to the way it was? And they've never answered me, and they've never put it back to the way it was. Anyway, I digress. But this guy, David Rifkin, who was like an oil and gas lawyer in the Commerce Department in the Reagan years, has put himself forward as the other side of the story, the other side of any story that might make a Republican office holder look less than perfect. And he's shown up in culture stories, he's shown up, and so part of what I try to say in the book is that there are habits, ingrained habits of mainstream journalism that really disable journalism from achieving its highest calling, which is not to tell people what to think, but to empower the citizenry with information to think for themselves and make their own decisions about how to be citizens in our complicated society. And that's not helped, in my opinion, by this cast of ready characters who pop up expressing their views on things that they really have actually no knowledge of. And so when I started going down this road a few years ago, I made it a practice of emailing reporters whom I knew and some who I didn't know who quoted David Rifkin and say, by the way, I'm just curious, how did he happen to end up in your story? Did you call him? Did he call you? And it's about half and half. He will put himself forward. There's another guy I write about. It's a different kind of journalistic problem. This is just the other side of the story problem. And we know that that's a major problem because there are lots of stories. A lot of stories, if they're really worth something, have many sides. It's very reductive to boil them down to two sides, for one thing. Some stories only have one side, and it's simply a fact. In this instance, that the President of the United States is not expected to be denouncing his own Justice Department for indicting people for crimes. I mean, it's just like wrong, and we don't need another side of the story. Anyway, another journalistic trope, you might say, is the phony expertise. The need for a reporter to quote somebody with a title and put words in the expert's mouth when actually the reporter who's done the hard, heavy lifting of actually reporting knows just as well and most likely better. So there's a guy who's a law professor at the University of Richmond. His name is Carl Tobias. By the way, I've met David Rifkin, he's perfectly nice. I've met Carl Tobias, he's perfectly nice. And I'm not actually criticizing them, I'm criticizing the use that journalism makes of them. So this guy, Carl Tobias, who has no ideological agenda, other than his real agenda is just getting his name in the paper. He lists in his curriculum vitae every letter to the editor that he's ever published. It's a very long document. So he shows up in stories about law, any kind of law. And I'm no major law professor, but I've been now in the legal academy enough to realize that people actually have specialties and they don't sound off on any old thing. Carl Tobias has been in the Times maybe 100 times in the last few years. And my favorite, and he would put himself forward. You would get an email that would say, happy to talk about whatever. So there was a major Supreme Court case late in my time on the beat, a case called Parents Involved, which was a constitutional challenge to the practice of some public school districts of kind of at the margins having racially conscious student assignment to basically preserve the hard-won gains of integration. This was Louisville, Kentucky, Seattle, Washington. They've been highly segregated, one by law, one by housing patterns. They were just trying to keep resegregation from happening. So anyway, I was at the argument, came back to my desk in the bureau, and there's an email from Carl Tobias who said, happy to talk about today's affirmative action argument. So usually I just ignored him, but this time, this really got my goat. So I emailed him back and I said, actually, Carl, this is not an affirmative action case. I get an email back, that's exactly the point I was going to make. So, so that's another problem that I try to point out. And I remember when I first got to Washington from Albany, as David mentioned, and I, at a kind of baby reporter age, had been the bureau chief in Albany and had written a lot of what we call Q-heads, news analysis and so on. And the first one I wrote for the Times in Washington, Johnny Apple, then the, deputy bureau chief, came up to me and said, this is pretty good. He said, if you can quote a few law professors in it, I can get it on page 1. And I said, Johnny, I don't care if it's on page D25, it is what it is. And I know what I'm talking about. And he looked at me like, whoa. So I think in the course of my time there, if I was known for anything, it was for almost never quoting anybody. Seriously. I mean, other than quotes from opinions, obviously, and I couldn't quote the justices. I didn't have sources. I never had a source at the Supreme Court. So, but, should I call up some lawyer somewhere in the country who maybe hadn't read the briefs or had an axe to grind or something like that? No. So really my journalistic point in writing the book was to just kind of call out these habits. Now, of course, as I was working on this project, we were favored with the rise of Donald Trump. And obviously, a fascinating challenge to the norms and habits of mainstream journalism. So what was going to happen? I did not know. And I started, this is back in, I'd say late 2015 or early 2016. I started chronicling the way the mainstream media dealt with the obvious untruths that were coming from not only Trump, but other politicians too, about a variety of things. And would it simply be rebutted with somebody else saying that's not true? Or at what point was the reporter going to be empowered to say, as we now take it as routine? I mean, there was a story in this morning's Times, I forget which of many subjects, I think it was Trump's speech to the UN yesterday, where just the, run of the story, he said, the president said, comma, without evidence, comma, but really, I mean, now we're used to that, but that's astonishing. This would never have happened 2 years ago. So I chronicled this with great fascination, through and including the point where the Times, in a very kind of bold and very self-conscious way, called Donald Trump, then the nominee, not yet the president, a liar in 36-point type in the lead of the paper over the birthright, the birth or citizenship matter, and so on. And I end with the question of whether something has changed in mainstream journalism's DNA because of this experience, or whether after Trump, assuming there is an after Trump and we're all still, the world is still spinning, we will revert back to these ingrained habits of many years, whether the Trump years will be an anomaly, or whether it'll change something in the willingness of mainstream journalism to confront untruths and not to think that there always has to be another side to a story. So maybe I'll just leave it there. And as I say, I'm happy to talk more about that. I suspect you're more interested in current events. And I gather there's, and David said he would call on people because he knows you all, and I don't. I do know a bunch of you, but not.
And Mike will run the microphone around the room.
Okay.
Let me ask the first question. Tell us about your book.
Well, I mean, I just was, but so I recount a few scrapes I got into over the years that I sort of had fun writing about. And
Because she's on the cover.
yeah, it's called Just a Journalist, and as I say, it's
Wonderful.
it's not a conventional memoir. It really is just a personal take on journalism as I did it and witnessed it, starting in college. I mean, I go back to some tales of my college newspaper days and my early Albany days. It's hardly anything about the court. It's much more, I was telling Clyde Haberman, much more about Albany, which was a wonderful, fascinating steep learning curve experience for me, foundationally. So the one thing I'll say about court coverage, though, is in my time there, of course, we saw the advent of the internet. When I started covering the court, nobody who hadn't actually physically been at the court and been handed the little printed booklet, which was the opinion, nobody could have access to it. And part of my job was to get 2 copies of everything that the court issued, bring them back to the Bureau. One of the copies would be bundled up and put in a sack and put on a Greyhound bus to the Port Authority, where somebody from the editorial board would go down and retrieve it, and in the fullness of time, the editorial board could decide what it thought about that. So, if I tell younger people today, that's like, was this like in the 1860s? No. This was, true and including the early 1980s. And so I think that's one reason why I got in the habit of never quoting anybody, because nobody I would have called, they could have been the biggest expert in the world on, antitrust or something, but I had the opinion that they didn't. So it seemed kind of silly to say, here's what the court did, what do you think about it? And they have to take my word for what the court did. So by the end, of course, the court has a pretty robust website. If anybody's interested in the court, supremecourt.gov. They put up the opinions within minutes of them being issued. They put up the argument transcripts within a couple of hours every day. They put up the audio of the arguments for the week. At the end of the week, they have all the briefs, all the petitions and everything. So at a certain point, I had kind of a midlife crisis, and I thought, okay, what's my job? Because anybody that's really interested can just get all this stuff with a few keystrokes, and they hardly needed my intervention. And I found this kind of depressing, and I was, really kind of in a low mood about it. And then I realized, no, what I could bring to the table was perspective and context. So where did this case come from? Why was it there? Why did the court choose this? What road did the court go down? What road did the court avoid in deciding it this way or that way? What does it portend about the future of the court as an institution or this doctrine, that kind of thing? And so, I felt at that point, sort of empowered that, sure, people could get the nuts and bolts, and I hope they do. But I felt maybe they needed me too. So that's a little wrap on the book.
Little commercial at the end of this luncheon. That wonderful book will be available to our members for $20, bargain price, and Linda will inscribe them.
And there are 22 copies left. You better hurry.
Linda, as a fellow Ford Foundation, lucky fellow Ford Foundation journalism fellow at the Yale Law School, I'm particularly intrigued by what is going on inside the building at 100, or whatever the address is, Wall Street in New Haven, and the allegations that a Yale law professor was grooming clerk applicants for Judge Kavanaugh by sending him photographs, and that the dean, now a woman, had to respond with a letter to the alumni. What is actually going on at Yale? I gather there have been demonstrations since then, and you obviously know exactly what's happening.
Actually, Alan, what you just said is something I don't know. Sending photographs? I had not heard that. Where
The Tiger Mom, Amy...
Yeah, I know. Well, what's your source for the photographs?
She advised applicants
Yeah,
who were applying for clerkships with Kavanaugh
yeah.
to dress in a certain way to appeal to the judge. And she invited them to submit photographs to her of what they might wear via email.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I'm not sure how interested people in this room actually are in what's going on at Yale Law School. I'll just say, everything has to be in a certain context. And, for instance, I was told that in the old days, Women who were applying for clerkships to Sandra Day O'Connor were advised to wear red because Sandra O'Connor really liked red. So I don't know. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't know the ins and outs of Amy Chua's clerkship practice. I think the desire for the great clerkship, and Kavanaugh was considered a great clerkship because you could catapult from him to the Supreme Court without much trouble, has a kind of distorting effect on the atmosphere at the elite law schools because there's lots of students and there's only yeah, the daughter got hired.
Next question, Linda. Over
Yeah,
here.
why don't we go to more journalistic
Thank you,
things?
Linda. Thank you for being here, by the way. I have a constitutional question for you because something creeped up on my Twitter account that said that Orrin Hatch was trying to get some legislation passed where Trump people and his family would not be prosecuted in state law. We have a federalist system. Is that possible?
Orrin Hatch is trying to get legislation passed to do what?
To prevent, that there's an ancillary side to the state law because some of the state law, money laundering and whatever, comes under state law as well as under federal law. And he was trying to prevent the states from prosecuting members of the Trump family and his and Trump.
That just sounds weird to me.
But is it constitutional?
Probably not, but it's the first I heard of it.
Thank you. I'd be curious as to your opinion on the appropriateness of the New York Times printing an anonymous op-ed page piece.
The question is, what do I think of the appropriateness of the Times publishing the anonymous piece? I thought it was fascinating and quite appropriate. I had no issue with it, but your implication is there is an issue with it? Okay.
Over here,
Hi, Linda. You mentioned that you didn't have any sources at the court when you were reporting. Do you know today, or do any of the justices speak on the record, off the record, to journalists? Do you have any sense of that?
So the question is, when I said I didn't have any sources and our justices today speaking off or on the record, I mean, I haven't actually, been working there for the last 10 years. I mean, certainly Justice Ginsburg, during the 2016 election, remember, she gave a series of interviews in which she said, if Donald Trump is elected, I'm moving to New Zealand. And she's still there. And, she then kind of walked it back. That was a very surprising turn of events. That was not off the record. Those were on the record interviews. I'm not aware of a kind of a reporter-source relationship with justices at the court. But, these days nothing would shock me, but I haven't seen any evidence of it.
And if he has been found to have perjured himself when he testified to his blamelessness in all sorts of ways, if he is not approved, is that a career ender for him?
So, of course, this is not a prosecution, so perjury would have to come in some other way. I think the smart money says he's going to be approved. The Republicans have tried for 40 years to get control of the court, and they're awfully close, and this is their main chance and an example of what's been going on in Washington. So you might have been kind of baffled, as I was, by this dispute between the Judiciary Committee and Christine Blasey Ford over whether her testimony was going to be on Wednesday or Thursday. That hung them up for a couple days, and I thought, what's going on here? Well, it was explained to me that if the hearing is on Wednesday, it can automatically be put over for 48 hours, which means the vote would be Friday. If the hearing is on Thursday, the 48-hour rule means the vote is not until Monday, which would give the Christine Blasey team a weekend of getting that story or further story out. And that, but what I heard last night is that by a majority vote, the Judiciary Committee has suspended that rule. And so even though the hearing, as it turns out, will be tomorrow, Thursday, the vote will be Friday. And it will go to the floor early the next week. So I think they are full steam ahead. And frankly, I was very surprised to hear that, because my thought was actually that he would withdraw, but I guess that's not happening. So, will there be a cloud over his 30 or 40, however long, many years on the court? It depends what people make of this. I mean, just speaking personally, having lived for 30 years within a stone's throw of the high schools that are under discussion here, I totally believe it. I mean, I raised a daughter in that atmosphere, and I'm having almost PTSD myself, realizing how close one's daughters were to disaster anytime any of these guys got within, a few blocks of them. So yeah, but then, we all have to decide for ourselves what, assuming the truth of the allegation as I do, what we make of it.
Linda, all the way down here.
Yes, this question comes from the nosebleeds. Thanks for being here. In your time covering the court, you went from putting decisions literally on a Greyhound bus to New York, and then having some time to read and digest those decisions before preparing your story, to flash forward to the 2000s. You're in this digital first, everyone's kind of falling all over themselves at the decisions as they're released to everybody at the same time, and I imagine that's only become more so in the last decade. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the pros and cons and what might have been lost in that time as people really sort of rushed to be first and not necessarily right in their reporting?
Yes. So I left just in time. I left the beat just in time. I had held on to my ability to do things the old-fashioned way. The Bureau indulged me for a couple of years after the Times was going more toward digital first. I said, I get the opinions at 10 in the morning. That's when they're issued. And my habit was, I did not keep a computer at my little cubby in the Supreme Court press room, was simply sit and read the opinion, read it page by page, mark it up, make my little marginal notes, figure out what I thought about it, and then, get on the Metro and go back down to the Bureau and start writing sometime in mid-afternoon. I mean, that also sounds like a voice from another age. And so now, what all the reporters, including my successor, very estimable Supreme Court correspondent Adam Liptak, have to do on major cases is write two versions of it, write the B matter to be top with the lead. In my way of thinking, that is tragic, because when I said a few minutes ago, what I could bring in the internet age when anybody can read the opinion for themselves for free, is context and talking about here's how the court went this way when it might have gone this way, or here's the nuanced difference in this and that. You can't do that in B matter. And what becomes salient about the background of the case really depends on what the court does with the case. And I would have been so miserable having to do it in the current age that I wouldn't have. I just would have had to take another beat or, move into a cave or something. So it's a very serious challenge. And, obviously the AP report, the wire service reporters have been doing this forever, and they're great. I always have had great respect for the wire service reporters who covered the court. They're all really at the top of their game. But it's, and I'm a very fast writer. I mean, I could, in those days, write, 3 stories a day. 4 almost killed me, but I could do 3 without, much turning a hair. So, but having to make a snap judgment without really having a chance to go through any kind of mental process. And we've seen, I mean, if you remember the first healthcare case, NFIB against Sebelius, back in 2011, 2012, I mean, I was getting it in my little office at Yale Law School. I was reading it online, and I figured it out. But so I was very surprised later that afternoon to get a call from the media reporter from the LA Times asking me what I thought of the fact that all these major news outlets had gotten the opinion wrong. I said, really? I'm unaware of this. I don't have a TV in my office. I wasn't watching. And apparently, a lot of them had gone on the air saying that Obamacare had been struck down by the Supreme Court. I said, how could that be? And then I realized how it could be. So every Supreme Court opinion comes with something called a head note, which is the official court summary of the opinion. And you can pick up the opinion, you can look at the head note, and it describes the case, and the bottom line, and it gives you the lineup and the vote and so on. So the Obamacare decision was so complicated that the head note went onto a second page. And on the first page it said, we strike it down under the Commerce Clause. On the second page it said, but we uphold it as a tax. And these people were under such time pressure that they couldn't turn the page. They never turned to page 2 of the opinion. And I have to say, Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the Times, I was told, as the day for the decision was approaching, came down into the newsroom and said to the whole national desk, I don't care if we get it first, I care that we get it right. And the Times did get it right on hard deadline on the web, empowered by realizing that, turn the page. But it's a serious challenge.
Linda, over here, please.
Where?
What do you think of the idea that the Republicans have a prosecutor from the West or Midwest who are going to question the two people tomorrow? What do you think?
Sorry, I heard that you're set up, but what is the question?
What do you think of the?
What do I think of it?
Of that person, that woman from Arkansas who's going to question them?
Yeah.
Arizona. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious the Senate Republicans, all guys, are just terrified of the optics of doing another Anita Hill thing. So there was, I think the Washington Post had an op-ed, the headline of which was, "Man up, Senator Grassley, ask your own questions," and I think it's a kind of a shoddy cop-out by them to do it like this.
Linda, for years, I have decried the fact that in our journalism profession nowadays, there is a lack of mentoring. And I want to go back to what one of your comments was in the beginning. And the question was, in the coverage of Donald Trump, is this coverage an anomaly, or do we think that this may be the future? With so many young reporters, and as you just said, being pushed to do things so fast on so many different levels, what do you think? Will it be the future, and how worried are you about that?
So you kind of conflated the mentoring and the. Okay, I think mentoring is really important. I think mature heads with experience are really important. And there have been times when I've wondered whether there were adults in the room. One of those times, I'll just say this, was the Times coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails. I thought that was out of control, and I didn't think there were adults who were properly supervising some of that coverage. I'll just leave it at that. But I was fortunate, and I write about this in the book, of having to have a wonderful mentor, a great New York Times editor named Sheldon Bin, who just set the highest standards of accuracy and fairness, and to get a word of praise from Shelley Bin could like make your month, and so I was very lucky in that respect, and I'd like to think that's available today, but sometimes I worry that it's not.
Over here, Linda.
Hello, over here in the nosebleeds on this side of the aisle. Looking back, do you think the coverage of the Anita Hill hearings was too fair and too balanced, given what we know today of Clarence Thomas?
No, I mean Maureen Dowd made her name covering the Anita Hill hearing, and she was Maureen, you know. No, I think that thought has never occurred to me. Actually, I think everything was on the table there. But I mean, if you think there's any evidence of people sort of holding back, I mean, the kind of walking on eggshells was not the media; it was the Democratic senators who completely didn't know what to do.
Hi. First, to follow up, in what way did you think the Hillary coverage was unfair? And second, you said the Republicans have been waiting for this appointment for 40 years, that is, to overturn Roe versus Wade finally. Do you think they'll succeed? Do you think there's another justice, perhaps Roberts, who could prevent it?
Okay, that's two questions. What did I think was unfair about the coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails? It was just way out of proportion. I mean, it was every day, and Donald Trump's very fascinating business dealings and connections and everything else was way beneath the surface. And I think the reading public would think the biggest problem in the country at that time was Hillary Clinton's emails, and I just think that was unfortunate. Do I think Roe against Wade will be overturned if Brett Kavanaugh or somebody else is a fifth vote on the court? Yes, actually I do. And I mean, they've been waiting 40 years not only for the abortion issue, but for control of the court on affirmative action, on religion, I mean, you name it, on race generally. And I think I can't think of a reason why they wouldn't do it if they had the votes. I've always thought if they had the votes, they would do it. And as long as they had Kennedy, they didn't have the votes. Clyde?
Your comments actually anticipate my question. We all listen with different ears. I'm reminded from my Japan years that Japanese officials said, I will do my best. Americans would hear, I'm going to really try to do it, and Japanese knew he was saying, forget about it. Similarly, when Kavanaugh says something like Roe v. Wade is settled law, I might hear one thing, meaning it's taken care of. What do lawyers hear? What do justices hear when they say, here, settled law? Does it mean something quite different?
Yeah, I mean, what a lawyer would say is, it's a precedent that's been reaffirmed numerous times, including as recently as the summer of 2016, actually, 2017 in the Texas case. But it's always possible for the Supreme Court to overturn precedents, and there was nothing more settled in law than a case that held, 1971, a case that held that the First Amendment was not violated by a system of public employee unions requiring employees who wish to opt out of the union to pay their fair share of the union dues, the agency fee. That was settled law. That was reaffirmed numerous times. Justice Sam Alito decided that he really didn't like that precedent. He teed it up through a few cases, and it was overturned in June. And that was, I think, the most important decision of the term. It has not gotten sufficient attention for what it tells us about the attachment of the Roberts Court to the notion of standing by, of stare decisis, standing by that which has been decided, and I think people are kidding themselves to think that it would stop there.
Over here, Linda.
There's a somewhat broader question that I think perhaps you might want to take a look at, and that's this business of having a pre-screened farm system of judicial candidates who are ideologically committed to a point of view, the Federalist Society being the case in point, and what that means for the long-term health of a so-called neutral, equitable justice.
Yeah, so of course that's a reference to the outsourcing of the of the nomination process to the Federalist Society and the Heritage Society. I think it's, you know, it politicizes the court even more than the court was already politicized. I think it sends a bad message to the public that, you know, we expect a court to simply dance to our tune. Now, I mean, not to be naive about it, and obviously every president deems the prospect of making a Supreme Court appointment to be one of the most important things that president's going to do, because it's going to long outlast the administration and so on, and presidents have wanted to pick a person who's going to project their own vision of what the law should be into the future. So Donald Trump is certainly not the first president to say, you know, I want to do it my way, but I think he is the first. I know he is the first to just sort of turn it over to somebody else. And of course, what's interesting is that in the first couple of iterations of the Federalist Society list, Brett Kavanaugh was not on those lists because, you know, Trump said he's going to drain the swamp, and Brett Kavanaugh is the embodiment of the swamp in the sense of, you know, the Washington insider inside the Beltway establishment. So it's just very interesting that, you know, how that came about. Now, Don McGahn, the outgoing White House counsel, spoke to the Federalist Society a few months ago, and he said, you know, I hear this criticism that we're outsourcing the judicial nomination process, but I've been a member of the Federalist Society for decades, so you might say we're insourcing it. So.
I have a question about whether you think the members of the Supreme Court should have lifetime appointments.
So that's a question about life tenure. So I've been agnostic about that for a long time, but I'm now coming around to thinking life tenure is not serving us well. You know, it's interesting that after the fall of the Soviet Union and new democracies, or once they were briefly democracies, started adopting a constitutional court system, none of them, they followed us in many respects, but not a single one of them followed us in life tenure. There's not another country in the world that has life tenure for its high court, and of the 50 states, only one, Rhode Island, has life tenure for its state Supreme Court. Everybody else has an age cutoff or a term of years, and you know, the proposal that's floating around would be an 18-year term. So, you know, what's kind of brought me around to that, I think, if we had 18-year terms, which would guarantee that every president would have 2 appointments, and it would regularize it. So it would kind of, you know, decompress a little bit what we have now, where you never know when the next one is coming. So each vacancy, each appointment has to carry such weight. You know, I mean, Jimmy Carter had none in his 4 years. Richard Nixon had 4. Ronald Reagan had 3, plus elevating Rehnquist to be Chief Justice. So the random nature of it just drives us all crazy. And not that a Supreme Court vacancy would ever be routine, But if you always knew in 2 years there's going to be another one, and you would know, and when you go to vote for president, you're voting for somebody who's going to have 2 Supreme Court appointments, and it just puts everything on the table so you can have sort of rational discussion about it, I think would be a better system. How to get there is a real problem. You know, constitutional amendment, that's the obvious way because it's hardwired into the Constitution. Some people say you could do it by statute if you keep life tenure as a matter of, you know, pay and privilege and so on, but only the most recently appointed 9 justices would be the active court, and the others would be the sort of court in waiting, or they would fill in or something. That's what happens on the courts of appeals, where judges are able, with a certain combination of tenure and age, to take senior status, and they're still fully Article 3 Constitution judges, but they're taking senior status creates a vacancy for somebody else. So that's kind of a model that exists there.
Linda, 2 questions. Justice Kennedy obviously was a swing vote in Roe, and when he decided to leave the court, he must have known that this was going to create a change on that issue, and that it would affect his legacy. And I'm wondering if you have any insights into or thoughts about why he chose to step down at this time.
So there's kind of liberal conspiracy theories running around that, Trump promised him, if you leave, I'll name your law clerk. I don't believe any of that, any of it. I'll say a couple of things. One, Kennedy in his last term never once voted with the liberals when it counted. There was not a single 5-4 case that he gave a 5th vote to those to his left. He wrote some pretty silly stuff, and his legacy is a very complicated one. The kind of word on the street is that at age 82 he was losing a few steps, and I think he struggled with whether to stay, because he did something that no justice has done for quite a long time, which is wait until the very end of the term. The most recent resignations, Justice Stevens, I think, was in March. Justice Souter was in April. Going back, there's obviously differences. Chief Justice Rehnquist died in office and so on. But when they could control the timing, they wanted to give the president more time, so it wouldn't be a midsummer kind of problem. And Kennedy didn't do that. And I gather what he said. He gives an interesting reason. What he said was, he didn't want his colleagues to know he was leaving, and they did not know, because he didn't want the shaping of the term for with the starting next week to be done in the knowledge that he wouldn't be there. So what cases to take and that sort of thing, and that it has a certain logic. But what I really think is he was just struggling with it, and his family eventually talked him into it.
Linda, there's been a lot of talk about whether the Republicans have learned any lessons since Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. And I wonder whether you think the press has learned any lessons about coverage of these kinds of issues since then. And I wonder what grade you would give the press overall right now in its coverage of the Kavanaugh decision, particularly at a time when none of us get our news from just one source. There's not just one Supreme Court reporter that we look at, but it's such a diversified kind of media picture. But what do you think about the job that the press is doing right now in covering this very contentious process?
Well, to your first question, what did the Republicans learn from Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill? Was just power through. Of course, the Democrats controlled the Senate at that time, so it was within the Democrats' power not to confirm him, and they blinked. But the Republicans certainly got what they wanted. To your other point, the sort of bifurcated or polarized press. It really, what you believe really kind of depends on what your source of news is. So, the Times has a good story today about a reporter went down south and just talking to people on the street. Who do you believe? And to a person, I think the story said they didn't find one person who believed the allegations, and they all thought it was just a setup and the fix was in, and so I think the mainstream coverage has been perfectly, to my way of thinking, straight and fair. I don't personally watch Fox News. Life is too short, but people that are just imbued with that point of view, I'm sure, in all sincerity, think that something really unfair is being perpetrated on the country. So we don't have common ground. We don't have Walter Cronkite. So it's a problem.
Linda, if Kavanaugh is confirmed and the Democrats sweep the midterms and maybe the White House in 2020, what do you think the chances are that the new president, if he's a Democrat, would try to pack the court, and would it be legal?
It would be this is the notion that, add 2 seats, one for the stolen seat that should have gone to Merrick Garland and one for what's happening now. Be totally legal. It's just a matter of statute. You'd have to get it through 2 houses of Congress just by a simple majority. The Constitution says nothing about how many justices. All the Constitution says, Article 3, there shall be one Supreme Court. Could be one justice, and it has changed over time. Of course, what I always learned from the court packing, FDR's effort to pack the court was that's a really bad thing. Nobody's ever going to touch that again. But, times change. So I think it's sort of unlikely, but I've read stuff from very smart, level-headed people saying this would be the way to go. I don't know. Watch that space.
Linda, to elaborate on an earlier question, if Kavanaugh is confirmed and takes his seat on the court, and in the ensuing months, more women come forward with corroborated evidence indicating that he was lying in the confirmation hearings, could there be an impeachment move, and how would it function?
Well, Supreme Court justices federal judges are open to it being impeached, and I think 10 or 11 federal judges have been impeached over time. It's usually it's always been for after conviction of a crime. Actually, that's not true. I think one was a substantial charge of a crime for which the individual was actually acquitted, but he was impeached anyway. So it would be like a presidential impeachment. It starts in the House and has to go to the Senate by 2/3. There were calls to impeach Earl Warren, impeach Justice Douglas. Obviously never happened, but people talk, Gerald Ford was leading the impeach Justice Douglas forces when he was in the House. So it's nothing that we haven't heard before.
Going back to your theory that Kavanaugh will get on the court regardless, and that he will overturn Roe v. Wade, let's go to the other question of presidential immunity from any kind of prosecution, from having to, his writings, what you know of Kavanaugh's writings about the power of the presidency. Do you see Trump being able to just get away with everything?
Well, so I'll say that I think the spin that was put on Kavanaugh's writings about presidential power and executive authority was actually unfair to Kavanaugh. I've read those law review articles, and I think he was channeling pretty conventional wisdom. And in fact, the one that people cite, oh my God, he let Trump get away with everything, he actually published while Barack Obama was president. So, it's always just been unclear. That's why Richard Nixon in Watergate was considered an unindicted co-conspirator, because it wasn't clear whether he could have been indicted. And it has remained, the courts never resolved that. It's remained unclear. And I think the more standard thinking is no, could not. Impeachment is the way to go, not criminal prosecution. So that's never actually been kind of a concern of mine with respect to Kavanaugh, and I thought it was a little tendentious as an anti-Kavanaugh talking point, actually.
And I'm an English lit professor, actually, and I teach a nonfiction course focused on the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And I was talking today in my class about the possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned. Now, there was a fascinating story in the Times about a week ago about how a particular decision by the Supreme Court has disappeared from recent talks about Casey versus Planned Parenthood. I'd like you to talk about that.
I think Adam Liptak wrote that story. What he's saying is, the law of abortion today really is no longer Roe. It's Planned Parenthood against Casey from 1992, which sort of refigured Roe, reaffirmed that there's such a thing as a constitutional right to abortion, but changed Roe quite a lot. And so that's the case. So when you say, will Roe against Wade be overturned, that's really a shorthand for will the court still regard a woman's access to legal termination of pregnancy a constitutional right? Whether you call it Roe, you call it Casey, you call it the case from last summer, Whole Woman's Health against Hellerstedt. So that's really the issue.
It's not referred to in recent decisions. It's disappeared.
Yeah, I don't read anything particular into that, except that people don't know Casey and they know Roe, and so it's a shorthand for kind of getting into the whole conversation, I think.
Hey, Linda, could you help us think about how Mueller's going to deliver his report? How you think the court would engage with that report? How might that play out?
When the question is, when Mueller delivers his report, what will the court do? I view the court as a passive observer of this. So, the Supreme Court doesn't have authority to sort of generate action. The court responds to cases that come to it. So if they're, sorry? Well, depending on, as I was just saying in answer to the other question, some prosecutorial entity would have to initiate a prosecution that would have to go, through a trial and an appeal, and eventually would get to the court like a normal criminal case. Or if it's indicting the president and the answer is you can't do that, that issue goes through the courts and gets up to the Supreme Court. In the abstract, it's just hard to say what would.
How about invalidating his authority as a special counsel?
Well, the question is, how about the court invalidating Mueller's authority as special counsel? Again, that would have to come in the guise of an actual case. Article 3 of the Constitution gives the federal courts jurisdiction to decide cases and controversies, and that's interpreted to mean an actual proceeding, adverse interest, one against another. There's an actual case, and the court gets those in the nature of appeals, and you can't have 9 or even 5 justices wake up one morning and say, we really want to get our hands on this. This was brought clear to me years ago. The court used to bring visiting Supreme Court justices from other countries through the court, and sometimes they would bring them to the press room to show them our wonderful free press. And a group of high court judges from China came just after, I guess in the Carter year, or was it Nixon? Anyway, just after was something about the Panama Canal Treaty or some major world event had happened. And these judges asked me, well, what is the Supreme Court going to do about this? And I said, they're not going to do anything about it. Well, why aren't they doing something about it? I said, the court doesn't have jurisdiction to just swoop into politics and, and do things. So all these are, fascinating questions, but they remain abstract until they're concrete.
And can you walk us through the possibility? Let's assume that Mueller gets a grand jury to indict President Trump. What would happen following that?
I assume they would challenge the authority of the grand jury or the prosecutor to do that, and that would work its way up to the court.
Who would challenge it?
The president and the president's lawyers.
Okay, they would challenge it and it would go to a district court?
Yeah. They would challenge it in the court under whose authority the grand jury is sitting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights, Linda. They've been so interesting. I'd like to know on a different track, what is your opinion of cameras in the courtroom, especially with the focus on what's going on today in terms of educating the people and public information?
Oh.
And one more. Why is Justice Roberts so opposed to it?
I think the court feels, so the question is, what are my feelings about cameras in the courtroom? I sort of have no feelings. I think it's not an issue that's ever, really engaged me all that much. I think they feel the court would be vulnerable to having little, snippets taken out of context, and that would make them look insubstantial or silly or bad or something, and that's probably true, right? And they generally, it's not just Roberts, it's all of them, feel, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if people want to know what was going on at the court, we put the transcript up every day. They can read the argument. And as we know, there's something about television that brings things home, and they'd rather have a little more remove. And I've always kind of respected that. I don't think television is necessarily your friend, although it's maybe your employer. But but I get where the court's coming from on that.
Over here, Linda.
There have been some law professor types who have made a distinction in terms of indicting Trump between actions that he carried out before becoming president and after becoming president. Do you have a view on that? The thinking being that he's indictable for acts while in office for what he did before becoming president, but not while he's in office.
Well, that was Clinton against Jones. That was the Paula Jones case, where President Clinton was saying, "I'm not, amenable to being sued while I'm president," and the court, it was unanimous. The court said, "Well, yes, you are." That was, of course, a civil case, but it derived from pre-White House allegations. So, whether that would carry to a criminal prosecution would be the question. But the court was very unsympathetic to President Clinton's arguments in that case.
Last question, Linda.
If Mueller were fired, what kind of legal action might he be vulnerable to if he released the report?
If Mueller were fired and chose to release his report anyway, what kind of legal action might he be vulnerable? I don't like to pretend to know more than I know. I never thought about that. Obviously, if it had classified information in it, that's a crime. But I don't know. I hate to end this very nice encounter by saying I just can't answer your question, but I really don't know.
You don't have to, because I have one final question, actually. Yeah. Generally, the court has, to a degree, reflected its times, the society it's in, and so on. So how likely, in your view, is it that a court that has now basically been taken over by conservative Republicans, if the country continues to drift towards the more moderate, younger points of view that are more moderate, how likely is it that this court might itself begin to bend in that sense and reflect the country going forward? And has that been the case in the past, in history?
Well, I mean, that's a deep question from political science. So, the court's always in some kind of dialogue with society, and the fact that the president's appointees far outlast not only that presidency, but the issues that were really most at the fore when those people were appointed, or that might have provided the reasons for those people to be appointed. Two political scientists who say, how does the court respond to public opinion? How does the court understand public opinion with respect to its own role, its own legitimacy? And the argument in this book is it's too simple to say, as many people do, the court responds to public opinion. The court responds to elite public opinion. They live among the elites. And to the extent, the thesis of this book is the extent to which the elites in American society today are more polarized, more divergent than they've been in many, many years. That explains the polarization on the court today. So that would be an argument against the kind of comforting notion that eventually the court kind of comes around to where we would like it to be. But certainly, I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, the court's going to be, this makes the court in the, hot seat, in the spotlight for the foreseeable future as we find it in this very afternoon.
So, two final points. First of all, we thank Linda quite. If you want more, much more, quite beautifully put together, her book, available for $20. There are 22 copies left.